Hello, everybody. Hello. Hello. There we go. All right. Welcome. My name is Suzanne Wofford. I'm the Dean of the Gallatin School, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you here tonight to this fall's Albert Gallatin Lecture. The Albert Gallatin Lectures are sponsored by an anonymous donor who wanted to create opportunities for building community at Gallatin and to bring speakers of public note, people who spoke with a voice beyond the university into the university community. So it's a total pleasure to be welcoming the Reverend James Lawson to speak about A Way Through the Chaos as our fall Albert Gallatin lecturer. As you will hear in more detail, he is, of course, a distinguished American activist and also university professor who has been a leading theoretician and tactician. I like that double powered, the practice and the theory of nonviolent civil disobedience, starting in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, but he's been teaching the principles of nonviolent civil disobedience and resistance for more than 50 years. In fact, tomorrow he'll be leading a nonviolence training workshop at 3, if there's anyone who would like to sign up for it. Perhaps there's still spaces. It's a special pleasure for me, for what I consider to be a historic opportunity, to have a leader from the civil rights movement who lived through the very beginnings all the way till now, to speak to us about this momentous set of changes in our culture that began in the 50s, 40s, even sooner than that, leading up to a moment where we've reached today of so much, I guess chaos is a good word that he has chosen. Because my own father was involved in the civil rights movement and also involved in teaching nonviolence, and James Lawson was a sort of mythical name in our household, so it's a special personal pleasure. However, I am not introducing the Reverend. I am introducing Michael Dinwiddie, who is a professor at Gallatin, who is uniquely responsible, I think, for this event. Without Michael, we would not be having the Reverend Lawson here to speak to us. So I want to give a special thanks to Michael for his activism, ingenuity, fundraising, creating of community, which is, I think, perhaps what Michael could be best described as someone who does. As you all know, or many of you know, Michael Dinwiddie is a dramatist whose works have been produced in New York Regional and Educational Theater. He's been a playwright in residence at a number of universities. He's taught playwriting in many places, including in Universidad de Palermo in Argentina. He has, some of his produced plays include The Beautiful La Salle's, Hannibal of the Alps, Dacha, Mask, A Guest of Honor, and The Carelessness of Love. He spent a year at Touchstone Pictures as a Walt Disney Fellow and worked as a staff writer on ABC TV's Hangin' with Mr. Cooper. He was awarded a 1995 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in Playwriting, and he received a 2005 NYU Distinguished Teaching Award. So he's a great playwright, he's a great teacher, and he's actually received an award of recognition from the Black Theater Network, where he was the president of the National Black Theater until last year, the National Black Theater Network. He is currently serves as chairman of the Duke Ellington Center for the Arts and sits on the advisory boards of the Atlantic Black Theater Festival, the International Colloquium of the National Black Theater in Winston-Salem, the Black Theater Network, of course, the New Federal Theater, among others. He's a member of the Dramatists Guild, the Writers Guild of America, and as I said, is immediate past president of the Black Theater Network. But what he's most, and I mentioned all this because I know that what he's most beloved for and known for here at Gallatin is as this stunning teacher. So I wondered how many of his students in the room even knew about all those credits that I just gave him. But he is, of course, famous for his courses, which include Migration and American Culture, Dramatizing History 1 and 2, which has now got a follow-up course being taught by one of Michael's former students, now a distinguished playwright who's carrying on the tradition. Poets in Protest, Footsteps to Hip-Hop, James Reese Europe and American Music, Cecil Blake and the Minstrel Tradition, Guerrilla Screenwriting, Motown Matrix, Race, Gender, and Class and Identity, and he's taught Cultural Memory and Resistance last fall, much to our regret, at NYU Abu Dhabi. We all missed him very much here in New York, but he's back, thank goodness. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Michael Dinwiddie to do the introduction of the Reverend.
Thank you, Suzanne. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. Now I understand why I'm not a dean, because my introduction is so much shorter. I told Reverend Lawson I thought I might be speaking tonight. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here. This is really a wonderful occasion. I should mention that the reason Reverend Lawson is here, I met him when I was living in Los Angeles when I went there to work in Hollywood. He was the minister at the church I went to. And I found him, I went to the funeral of one of my cousins. And it was such a great eulogy, I wanted to go back and hear what he had to say for the living. So, it's really true. And this morning, and I'd written up a long introduction, a whole thing, and when I called Reverend Lawson to read it to him, he said, most of that is incorrect. What you see online is incorrect. It's not true. They're calling me the wrong thing. I was not a conscientious objector. I was a draft resistor, et cetera, et cetera. He told me that he started at the age of 4 with his protest. As a child, he was slapped by someone. No, he slapped someone who called him a name, and he went home, and his mother said, this is not the way to do it. And it started him thinking whole process. And so in high school, sit-ins, in college, he became a draft resistor. He went to prison as a draft resistor for the Korean War, and now I'm going to go to my script. This morning, I had breakfast with Lawson, and he said something that's going to color my introduction. He flew in from California last night, and we met at 10 a.m., actually 10:15. I said, oh, you must be so tired. It's still 7:15 since you're still in California time. And he said, no, I live in the present. It's 10:15. Nothing better describes his ceaseless quest for social justice and equality than this simple statement. From the Nashville student movements of the 1960s to his involvement with great workers in California, the training of union leaders for restaurant workers, the DREAM movement in the US, it's the present that engages his passion and his involvement. No turning back, no turning back. I would like to now, believe it or not, acknowledge the committee that was responsible for bringing Reverend Lawson here, because there's a whole group of people talking about community. NYU community really came together for this. So professors Nina Kornitz, Laura Slatkin, George Schulman, who wasn't on the committee but worked closely with the committee, Vasuki Nasaya, Louise Hartman, Hannah Gurman, who served as chair of the committee, and Aaron Sedolia, communications director for the Gallatin School. And the evening was really made possible from generous support from many different schools at NYU. On the way over, we bumped into Uli Bayer, who was the vice provost for Faculty Arts, Humanities, and Diversity. Bridget, where's Bridget? There she is. Bridget McCurtis, assistant vice provost for diversity and senior director of the Arthur O. Eve Higher Education Opportunity Program. Patricia Carey, associate vice provost, diversity programs, and associate dean of student affairs at Steinhardt. Dean Frederick Schwarzbach of the Liberal Studies Program, Professor Joyce Apsel of Liberal Studies, Anita Farrington, Associate Dean of Students at the Tandon School of Engineering, Renee Blake, it's a long list, it's a real communal experience here. Renee Blake, Director of Africana Studies in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, Monroe, France, Associate Vice President for Student Diversity, and Imani Brooks from Center for Multicultural Education and Programs. A Way Through the Chaos is Reverend Lawson's topic this evening. Without further ado, I welcome Reverend James M. Lawson to the podium.
Thank you very much. Now, do I need this mic in front of me? Oh, I do? So I need two mics? The one I have, the one I'm wearing, and this one? I do. So I can't move around then. I have to stand still behind this platform. No, that's all right. No, I don't want that one, because I want to use my hands. I like to use my hands. So you all are going to confine me to standing here only. Well, let me tell you how delighted I am to be here. Not only because of Michael, but because of the reputation of New York University. And Michael has been an excellent guide today to inform me on some things I absolutely did not know, and things that I will be looking for in the future in my own journey. I am more than pleased. You have warmed my heart in many different ways. I've looked forward to hear this since the early months of 2016 when we firmed up the date and the time, and I've looked forward to being here. This is the first trip I've taken in the fall. I've cut back on my travel a great deal and lecturing. In 2014 and 15, I experienced a bout with cancer, and so stopped traveling in order to make that the first business of my family, the first business for myself. I've spent the last year now, I am cancer-free thus far, for at least a year. You know, all of us human beings struggle on many different fronts at the same time. But I'm now cancer-free for a year, full year so far. And as I read the emails from George Schulman and others here, I wanted to eagerly come, but wanted to be slow about it. And then, of course, Michael Dinwiddie did begin to call me, and we talked directly several times, and we're able now to fulfill this mission to be at New York University. And that pleases me a great deal. I shall confess that I tend not to use emails for important events, important people. If people want to be in touch with me, the best way is to call me so I can talk face to face. I am one of those people who's of the mind that the technologies have not helped us to improve human community, human concord, human understanding, have not helped us to understand each other and to accept the wonder and splendor of being alive and human on this planet Earth, in this vast universe of ours. And so I tend not to use some forms of technology at all, and think much of it is maybe too much in order to build the community for justice and truth, the community for struggle, to help tear down the old that needs to be torn down, and to lift up and build, make spaces that are available for new ways of understanding and new ways of life and new structures for community. So I'm pleased to be here. I appreciate the words of the dean. This is true. Her family is very much a part of the empathy for the struggle. Her father probably was responsible for the winning of the 1959 presidential election for John F. Kennedy, the first Roman Catholic. And some of us who have perhaps lived through that period will know that and a lot of the prejudice and fears of the Roman Catholic was astonishing. And so he had to fight that battle of religious bias in the United States, in spite of what we think is religious freedom. And her father was one on the campaign staff, and had Martin Luther King's home phone number in his pocket. And when Martin King suddenly was picked up off the street for an old warrant and taken to jail, unbeknownst to anybody, everyone feared for his life. And Harris convinced John Kennedy, to the dismay of Robert Kennedy, to call directly to Coretta King, and he did. And that enabled him to win a very narrow election. In fact, his father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a staunch, conventional, black Republican leader in Georgia, and for a lot of Baptist folk. And when when John F. Kennedy called Coretta, Daddy King said, "Well, that fixes it. I'm voting for John F. Kennedy." Up to that time, no president no candidate for the presidency had identified with, in a sense, a kind of militant radical resurgence of struggle against the darkness of segregation and racism. That was an opening. It also helped us to see the possibilities to enlist the White House in the struggle for change. So all of that falls in on me, and I'm just very pleased to be here. I want to come back to this topic, if I can, a way through the chaos. And I'm going to try to do this within about 40 or 45 minutes, and then allow for time for give and take among us, if that's at all possible. And I think I'll put this watch in front of me to try to see if it will do me any good to pay attention to the time. A way through the chaos. I like this topic that, in fact, Michael helped me to shape over the phone, because it reminds me of one of the most significant and most important books written in the 20th century. That's the book by Martin Luther King Jr. in 1967, entitled "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" And when scholars, for the most part that I know of, and I don't know all the books yet, so I'm still catching up and reading books from that period since the 50s. But in large measure, the Academy has not, of social sciences, of historians and political sciences, have not really done the civil rights movement justice in some very tangible ways, very important ways. And the truth of the matter is, sisters and brothers, if we don't get the story of our nation and of the vast peoples of our nation right, if we don't make the story inclusive and understand enough of it so that we know who we are and where we've been, we're never going to become the people that we can become. So the story is important. Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community is King's effort, in a sense, to summarize his own thought, but to summarize at the same moment the movement and what it meant to the United States and what it had to mean for the future. So I called it one of the most significant books of the 20th century. And if you have not read it, you are not a learned person. You cannot be a member of this society Well, you can be. You can be a James Simon and not know the book and build your own empire in a direction that is highly destructive of our country. But if you love the 320-odd million people who call ourselves the people of the United States of America, you have to know that book. And King, in that book, tries to help us to recognize that the big question of what is called the civil rights movement is a question to all the people of the land. Do you accept the notion that July 4th, 1776, or maybe July 1, 1776, or July 5th, 1775, as the people of the 13 colonies shaped the notion, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that all are endowed with certain unalienable rights by the Creator, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That is the heart of how the 13 colonies came together to form the United States of America. And King said, either we choose community, that is, becoming a people, diverse, millions of us, a nation with tremendous possibilities, has shown great strength in a great variety of ways. Either we choose this vision of a society where human beings are seen of great worth, and each baby anywhere in the nation is provided with the access, no matter their family, to grow into the fullness of what it is to be human and alive, to grow into the fullness of a human being in the universe. Either that or the experiment with the first democracy for ordinary people like ourselves will, of necessity, falter and probably fail. And that's the opposite of that, is the chaos we have in the presidential election. That's the chaos. King said, either we choose to build a nation in which there's access for every person. Every person is known to be a person of worth, regardless of how you identify them. Or the nation slides into the distress of massive unfaithfulness to the vision, and therefore into chaos, into calamity, into confusion. And in my own 8 decades of living now, we have never lived, in my own judgment, I have never lived in a more confusing time. And what is at stake in the presidential election, more than who wins, is whether or not we, the people, recognize that in this chaos there is a way forward, there's a way onward if we want to wrestle with it and understand it. If we want to be a people committed to the most heroic, boldest, most noble vision of what it means to be human and to be alive. And so the point that I want to make after that is simply this, that how the civil rights movement is understood is oftentimes, it seems to me, mistaken. I've decided that the civil rights movement, the term comes from 1866, when the Congress of the United States passed the first, what they called the Civil Rights Act. And that Civil Rights Act did this. It declared that every person born in any of the states of the United States is a citizen with the exception of the indigenous people, the Native American. So that bill was titled the Civil Rights Act. It became the law of the land, and is still current because it was debated quite a bit in the Republican primaries last year in 2015. But the civil rights movement, that term has to be corrected. That term connects with kind of an umbrella omnibus term. It has been used by the media, and so I assume it can't be unused. It's been used by the media to type almost everything since then connected with black folk. In that respect, it's a racist term because it's enabled so many Americans to see in the press civil rights movement and then to move on to decide that that relates to people of color and doesn't relate to the whole of the nation, to all the people. What is called the civil rights movement, especially the King Whig dimension, really is what Congressman John Lewis has described more accurately as the nonviolent movement of America. That more accurately frames it as one dimension of the CRM. Vincent Hardy, the historian who died a year or so ago now, has called it the Black Freedom Movement of the South. I've called it the second revolutionary movement of the United States, because that movement, for the first time, ignited across our country the first discussion on freedom, equality, liberty, justice, and what kind of people we are to become since, in fact, 1774, 1773, 1766, 1766. Which is why, therefore, in the year 2013, Time magazine put Martin Luther King Jr. on the front page of its cover and said, and called him a founding father of the land. I hope you understand that. No, he wasn't there in 1776 for the finishing of the Declaration of Independence, nor was he there in 1789 for the writing of the Constitution. But Time said in the 20th century, this movement for which he is an advocate and spokesman and symbol represents doing some of the work that 1776 could not do on behalf of an experimental effort of being self-governing, a self-governing people. That's a far nobler notion of what this movement was about. Because as I moved around the southeastern part of the country in many of the different campaigns, as an organizer for Fellowship of Reconciliation, then as an organizer for SCLC, organizer of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, I know of no local movement who said we are a movement for civil rights. All the movements of which I was a part talked about freedom, equality, dismantling Jim Crow law and segregation, lifting up what some of us called the beloved community, becoming a people with a common drive that we're going to help make life accessible to every person in our land, wherever they live. So I want to push you hard to understand how I understood what I was doing from 1958 to 1974 in Nashville and Mississippi and lots of other places. So I invite you to understand, therefore, that this movement still poses to the American people a question of how we move from where we are today to where we want to be. And an election process, really, as that process has been captured by the forces, I'll say the forces of ill will for the American people, cannot do it and will not do it. It is we the people who must do it if the many other officials of our nation are going to get involved in making it happen. So that's the first sort of major introduction to my remarks, the way through chaos. The way through chaos towards community, towards a better democratic society. It's important to add to that, we are not a democracy, and we have never been a democracy. We are not a democracy. We have never been a democracy. From my perspective, the 2016 election, in one way, demonstrates that. Because I happen to think that we 320-odd million people have produced a far greater number of competent, intellectually astute people of vision, understanding compassion, knowing their own human journey, far more than a great number of the people who are running for office in 2016. We have produced far better than this. Some of you in this very room would probably make a better senator, a better congressman, a better federal judge, a better president, a better vice president, a better majority leader of the House, or majority leader of the Senate than the ones who are there now. I will say that without reservation. And anyone who thinks that the cream of our land has come to the top obviously do not know what cream is. And I've been fairly mesmerized by the land in which we live, because many, many of us are confused and the rest of it. So, in some ways, let me try to see if I can help to unscramble this a little bit for you. So the second major point I want to make is this, that our nation today, we the people, the nation, almost every institution, I suppose in large measure the academy has been a part of it. We have been largely shaped by four forces in our history, which I call the forces of spiritual wickedness in our country, and have in many ways muted the vision and forged among us ideologies and structures that have always moved us in the opposite direction of a society of access for all. So I'll name these four forces, and they're deeply connected to each other. They are almost like a quilt in the way in which they have shaped thought across our land. And they are so interwoven that you really cannot be a person for social change if you do not see their connections and feel their connections and hear them and work on them, and no matter whatever kind of issue you're working on. These four forces are racism, sexism, violence, and what I tend to call, for clarity, plantation capitalism. Plantation capitalism, violence, sexism, and racism. These four elements of our history can be divided up into various pieces and parts, but they all share a common twofold structure. Number one, they offer people a cheap mythological ideology that contradicts our historical documents. As a theologian, I'm not going to talk about the contradiction of scriptural, Jewish Christian Bible, scriptural analysis. I won't talk about that. But the folk who wanted independence before July 4th, 1776, and they were in every colony, were people who thought that by having a Declaration of Independence, they would give themselves a document that could become a major source of public conversation, a major source of politics, a standard by which to compare where they were and how progress was being made or not being made. So, those documents, the founding fathers, the people of that age, though there were women in that discussion, though there were Indians in that discussion, if we listen to some of the books of the 20th century that have been published from diaries and letters in localities like Columbia, South Carolina, black folk were in that discussion in many parts of the country. So it wasn't primarily a discussion in the 13 colonies of white men. It was a discussion in which poor people participated, indentured servants participated in it, and all. And that discussion gave a great amount of attention to, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that all are endowed by the Creator, and so forth and so on. But the elements of racism had already been laid in the land by 1776, by 1789. Some of you know that. The indigenous people were seen as the other. They were seen with a different culture, so it was determined that already the European culture is a far greater culture than the Indian culture. The elements of white supremacy began, and the thought that the Indian people were to be destroyed so that we could have the land became a paramount force that governed the way in which we became 50 states. So that's the beginning, in large measure, of the racism. That then, of course, with African slavery, indentureship, 1619 and all, helped therefore by 1870, helped therefore the reactions to the Reconstruction period to shape and codify racism as dark codes and as Jim Crow laws, as discrimination against people of color. The same can be said in terms of the sexism that we males brought to these shores from Europe primarily. An ideology that women are inferior, they're less competent, less able than we of the male. We're seeing in the front pages of the last several days the abject form of ideology in the assault on women, verbal and otherwise, that has been a part of our society for a very, very long time. It's never been faced by the nation as a whole. I happen to think that it's progress, that it's finally being faced, even if we do not like how it's being explored in the media. nevertheless, I mean, I'm sure that female students at NYU have been dissatisfied with the way the administrations have cared for the issue of sexual assault and rape on the campus. And of course, the academy hasn't known how to face that. With our preoccupation for the alumnus and for the donors, we have not wanted to become too controversial, and we haven't wanted the exploring of this kind of a issue that might then cause parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles to decide, well, they can't allow their female offsprings to come to NYU or to Vanderbilt University or to UCLA and elsewhere. So we have, in some ways, the academy has participated in not pushing our land to airing the question, airing the problem, and allowing, therefore, creative forces and juices to somehow help us move through the problem. The third force, of course, is violence, because racism is a violent entity. Sexism is a violent entity. It's the violence of speech, the violence of mythology and imagery. It's the violence of the fist or the hanging rope or the gun. It's violent. And that's part of the mythology of both racism and sexism. And part of the problem with our people, with this country of ours, engaged in the mythology of violence. So that in Black Lives Matters, which is the second major movement in the last 75 or 80 years, second major movement coming out of the black community calling for the dismantling of the racism, of the systems, of the structures. It's the second major movement since King to do the big business work of dismantling the stuff that has to go on. Because we do not have the space for the new society to emerge if we don't dismantle the old that is so much of a tyranny upon the lives of so many people. And then the fourth ideology, the fourth force, plantation capitalism. And I use this deliberately because plantation capitalism helped to reinforce male chauvinism, sexual assault on the women, helped to reinforce the notion that an economy is about creating some minority of people who have great power through wealth and through land. So it's a part of the wrong that is laid before us. I maintain that people who want to do a general critique of capitalism miss the boat in the United States, because in the United States, a slave economy and a slave-based economy, an economy based upon a human being being property, was for 250 years a major part of the national economy and the national move of the geography of our land. And not to see, therefore, that today wages going down and trying to press human beings into an assembly line for common life, and the creation of the notion of robots that displace people is a part of what plantation capitalism has taught we, the American people, that we have to face if we're going to change it, if we're going to have an economy that is open to far more access and far more possibilities. So two facets of agreement on these: the mythology of ideology and then the structures of tyranny. Those structures have to be dismantled, and no movements of social change are valid in our land unless there's this double kind of process going on, the dismantling to allow space for people to experiment with the new possibility of what it means to be alive, what it means to have a democratic society. But this is terribly complicated, and I want to lift up for just a moment a couple of the complications. Because in the present election, all the truth is not on one side, and it's not in the media. It's not in the talking heads on radio and television. Donald Trump, for an example, has said a couple of things that represent more truth than what we're willing to accept. Let me just directly quote him from the last couple of days. I call the White House and I get a reply. This was in the primaries. And then he waved at the 16 or 17 people who were on the platform with him and said, I can get what I want. I've contributed to all of these candidates. He said, I can get what I want. I'm a smart businessman. He is speaking the truth, whether we like it or not. He can call the White House and get a reply. He can call the Secretary of the Interior and get a reply. You can't do that. I can't do that. Ordinary people can't do that. All sorts of lobbyists who make donations can call your mayor, your congressperson, your senator, and get a reply. But we, the people, almost cannot get a hearing. And I've sat in congressional offices in the 60s. I stopped doing it by the end of the 60s because I felt personally it made no difference. Not only that, our delegations knew more about segregation and racism and desegregation than the congressperson or the senator. They didn't know anything in comparison. I went to a senator from Tennessee with a delegation of clergy on the Vietnam War. That senator did not know that much about Vietnam. Any number of the clergy people from his state who sat around his office and talked to him had done intense study on Vietnam. I had read about it and studied it since 1945. Yes, exactly. He knew little or nothing about it. So what I'm trying to say is that we have to understand we do live in a society where a Donald Trump can get a reply and a hearing, but the legitimate needs of 80 babies a day who die in the United States in the first 12 months of life cannot get a hearing. I want you to hear that. The 80 babies of all complexions, all across the geography of our land, who die daily in the first 12 months of life, not their own fault by any means, not the fault of their parents either. They cannot get a hearing in sometimes even the mayor's office. Here again, Donald Trump. There is nothing the political establishment will not do, no lie they won't tell. Now, he means a very narrow political establishment, but the political establishment is the Council on Foreign Relations, housed in New York City. Political establishment is the Pharmaceutical Association. The political establishment is not just the Congress or the presidents or the vice presidents or the White House. The political establishment is Wells Fargo, Bank America, the American Express represents the political establishment. And they do lie. And they do do what they want to do regardless of their well-being of the people engaged in it. So it's more complex than just either or. How does our society listen to the truth? Since NAFTA was passed in the 90s, 57,000 factories have left this country to be relocated elsewhere. That's a fact. You can go research it yourself. 57,000 factories have left Massillon, Ohio, and Pulaski, Tennessee, and Los Angeles, California, the Watts area, and New York State. And 7 million jobs have also relocated with those 57,000 factories to other countries. That is an economic fact. The pain in the United States because of how the business establishment wants to govern the economy, wants to govern not just the United States, but the nations of the earth, is a factor of not only the complexity of our scene, but also a factor of what you and I have to understand if we're going to create a movement in the 21st century that will change the direction of the nation and begin to put back into place the possibilities of a society more open to change. And that's why then the third and final point I want to make is concerning nonviolent struggle and nonviolent activity, because we have more activism in the United States than we've ever had in my lifetime. More people engaged in wanting change, in talking about change than I've ever known. On more different issues, so many different issues, in fact, that people have a hard time trying to put a priority on their lives. I say this in personal counseling with a number of students I've met over the last 4 or 5 years who have put so much attention to their social concerns that they've forgotten the major task of getting their academic credentials, without which, their lives are not going to do what they want them to do. So you have to create priorities in your life. You cannot forget the credentials all along the way, especially in the first 30 or 40 years of life. So I want to lift up to you that the only possibility for the changes that we want is through nonviolent struggle, nonviolent conflict, nonviolent struggle, building campaigns of nonviolent power, which is essentially power that comes and emanates from the consent of all kinds of people. The movement of between 1953 and 73, where I lodged the nonviolent movement of America, did create the power for change. We did change America forever, in spite of how the opposition worked, in spite of the opposition since then. And you have to recognize that the Tea Party and the Republican Party and many of the different shades within the Democratic Party all represent the opposition that developed in the 70s and 80s and 90s against what sometimes I call the Rosa Parks movement. Many elements in the public scene today are the remorphing of the forces of spiritual wickedness in the United States and pretending to be a part of the force for spiritual righteousness and truth. And that adds to the confusion and the calamitous chaos of the present moment. But I maintain that nonviolent struggle can cut through much of that and create a different possibility. And so I want to suggest to you that the first level of nonviolent struggle, is you. The first point of nonviolent struggle is each one of you. The political philosophers of the 19th century said this, but the person who put this on the map intellectually and pragmatically was Gandhi of India, as he began to work in South Africa as an immigrant in South Africa. Because Gandhi felt, especially as he returned to India in 1925, began to become, 1914 rather, and began to become a part of the Congress Party and the Self-Determination Party in that jewel colony of the British Empire. He said something like this, that the British government can only be here in India because we have consented to their presence. He disturbed people like Jawaharlal Nehru when he made that statement the first time and continued to push it. But he said, we're a country of 350 million people. The British cannot occupy us with a few 100,000 troops and soldiers if we, the people, have not agreed that they can be here. And the Congress Party never did really catch up with Gandhi's insistence that one of the first steps for developing the movement that would overthrow the British colony, India, would be millions of ordinary people of the land saying, we no longer want you here, saying no. Now he's put his focus there on the inordinate, misunderstood power of a single human being in conjunction with other human beings. I'll try to not do this too long, but I could give illustrations of this that I'm tempted to do from American life and history. But the first level of power is for each of us, you and you and you and you, to claim the power of life that is in your gift of life. And recognize it's the power to say yes or no to a great variety of dimensions of the human journey. That's why I came to understand nonviolence, not from David Thoreau, but from my own mother and father, and from singing as a toddler in my father's church, "Go down, Moses. Go down to Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go." That song and many songs like it is what my slave ancestors sang and composed, that gave them a deep sense that inside their lives they could master their souls, retain their humanity under the dire circumstances of slavery, and work for the day and wait for the day and watch for the day when slavery would be abolished. A biologist from the 20th century, a man by the name of Bern Meyer, speculated on life itself in an essay where he wrote that the planet Earth in 4.5 billion years or so probably had housed 50 billion species, living species of many different sizes, shapes, and forms, and many, many different dimensions of life energy. 50 billion. He said many of these species have now died out, and they're dying off. Maybe they last only more than 100,000 years at the most, and they disappear. They have disappeared. But then he said, the human being is the only living species that has learned how to sing and play music. And I'm using my words now. It's the only species that has learned language. It's the only species that has learned how to put together a household in a village, to build a skyscraper. It has learned to fly when ancient human beings often thought about flying like the birds. We have learned to fly. We have learned to fly not by disobeying the laws of the universe or the laws of gravity. We have learned to fly by obeying the uses of force in the universe. Well, I'm relating this to say to you that, especially you who are shaping your course of life for the next 30 or 40 or 50 or 80 years, that your life is a gift of the universe. It's a gift of what we in the Hebrew Christian religions call a gift of God. You are the only species made in the image of life itself. Your life has invisible power, not just in your growth thus far as a person, not just in the way you read and study and think and write and interrelate to one another and to yourself. Your life can be a center of the kind of power that can say no, even in tough times, or yes to the things that make for life. So the first level of power in nonviolence, and nonviolence is not about passivity, and it's not less militant than violent. The campaigns of nonviolence in this country have been extraordinary, and the people who have waged them from time to time have carried the human scene to an enormous level of awareness. So if there are to be those movements, not the elections, but the movements that are to shape the elections of the future, we need people who are committed inwardly and outwardly to experimenting with the truth of nonviolent struggle and nonviolent life and nonviolent understanding of self and others and of the world in which we live. Now, such an understanding does mean that you have an implacable awareness of the failure of violence, which our society lacks. We want security. And you read this all the time. But we are a people with over 800 military bases in more than 100 countries, with air fleets and naval fleets that govern every ocean, literally the space of every country, the airspace of every country, and we're still seeking security. And our military are telling us that the more we keep it out there, the safer we are here at home. But wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible says that you only get security and stability through justice. You cannot get it through the weight of the chariot or the war horse or the sword. Stability of a people comes with developing a community of justice and fairness, of equality for all. So I suggest to you this is what is behind and about the movement of the 50s and 60s, and it's the only way through the chaos in our nation today and into this decade of life. We must somehow tear down the false gods if we want a better land and a better people. Violence has reached a kind of climax that can only go further in devastation, but cannot go further in solving the problems around which the fighting has been made, or heal the families that have been devastated, and the rest of it. Violence in the American scene will only grow. It will not decrease from the approaches that we're making towards it. It will only increase and escalate. Violence in Syria can solve none of the problems that pain the people of that country or the people of that part of the world. It has no solutions to the political issues or the power issues. It has nowhere to go but towards greater sabotaging of life, greater devastation of mostly the women and the children. We in the United States are, for the benefit of you and many others, where we are because of three massive nonviolent movements that helped to lift this people towards greater access. The women's movement, 1910 to 1920, remarkable struggle. Lucy Burns and Alice Paul, extraordinary people that we need more of in our nation. The working families movement of 1933 to 53 is what created Social Security. Even more important than that, it caused a lot of people in government to say that government must work for the general welfare of all the people, which was a departure from government up to that time. And the movement I call sometimes the Rosa Parks movement, Rosa Parks' dimension of the civil rights movement, had a Congress and a president passing the most progressive legislation on the part of the people that any Congress had ever passed. Legislation on early childhood development, legislation on housing for affordable housing, legislation that for the first time said that there can be in business or public sector no discrimination against any citizen for a job by virtue of color or gender or religion or national origins. Then later was added for disability, physical or personal disability. First time in the nation. For the first time in the nation, a unanimous Supreme Court said that segregation is unconstitutional. It's illegal. It can't be done if the Constitution is to be obeyed. For the first time ever in the history of the Constitution, a Supreme Court said, this is what the Constitution requires. The argument and the quarrels and the conflicts over the Supreme Court today came out of that decision of May 17, 1954. The Federalist Society that was organized later, the talk about who should be on the Supreme Court is because the forces of spiritual despair want a Supreme Court that will continue the hypocrisy of the past, that there are citizens in our land who have no rights, that need to be acknowledged by other citizens. That must end. But that did begin in that campaign. It was a limited campaign. It accomplished more than what we know. But my own appeal to you this evening is that in the 21st century, there must be major campaigns in local places that will do more for we the people, to lead us through the confusion and to help us to build the society we want for ourselves and our posterity. One way of doing this, incidentally, would be if Hillary Clinton could get the gumption to say something like this, that the first order of business that I will have if elected president will be to put together a task force to see to it that every baby born in our society is going to have access. What the Children's Defense Fund calls a head start, a healthy start, a safe start, a fair start, a moral start. That would be a great beginning point to help shape all of our directions into the priority of our babies and children. For after all, your agenda and my agenda is not the agenda of big oil or big bombs. It's not the agenda of the James Simons of the Renaissance hedge fund. Most of us here in this space are concerned for our own well-being and the well-being of our families, of our children, our sons and daughters and grandchildren. Most of us have that as the urgent thing that we must work at and help to engage day after day, week after week, and month after month. So I would say to you, for an example, that that's the agenda of most people. That agenda for our babies all around the world, regardless, all around the nation, wherever they are born, or whatever kind of family. That kind of agenda would give millions of people in the United States now who are confused a chance to say, yes, that's the way through the chaos and the confusion. We are not at the best place at all for our society and for our experiment of becoming a democracy. And only if we're prepared to try to emulate the nonviolent campaign of the 50s and 60s and build upon it, only if we're prepared to see that there is a science of social change that cannot be denied, is as significant in the world of social history as is the law of gravitation. And only if we're prepared to see the extent to which the nonviolent intervention of the last 100 years has an offering for us, will we create the nation and the people that we want to be. But I insist that the future is not in the hands of violence or fear or confusion or chaos or the sabotaging of ourselves. The future is in each of our hands, of each one of you, if you're willing to tap the power of creation that is life in you, and you're willing to live by that force of creation, and thus help our nation and our Western civilization move from violence to a community of peace and justice, move from hatred to compassion and care for life, all of life, move from confusion and violence to a way through that will enrich life in unimaginable fashion. Robert Louis Stevenson, the American literary person and poet of the 19th, 20th century, said something like this: "To be what you are and capable of becoming what you are becoming is the single role of life. And it is out of that role of life that can emerge a society where, in fact, there is equality, liberty, justice for all, and a community which is every day working on access for those who most need access." Thank you. 45.
You got me on? Great. If we have time for questions, if anyone has questions or comments.
And disagreements.
No one would ever disagree. Okay.
Clarity.
Here's one. Oh, he's got one behind.
Hi. One question that I've been struggling with in terms of trying to communicate these similar ideals to my own family is that I really liked the phrase that you used, the plantation capitalism, because I've been recently reading a book called The Warmth of Other Suns, and there's a great passage about the same thing. My parents are all for social justice and social cause, but they somehow don't seem to understand the connection between our current economic system and the racial and sexist institutions that have governed them. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions for how to help open that without making them and then, other people who I'd like to give the same message, or people would like to give the same message, without telling them that their entire way of life is wrong, that there's something that they're going to lose by the acceptance of that idea.
Does everyone hear that question? It's a very personal one and a very important one. Well, I think that in social activism in the United States today, in many, many places that I see and visit and listen to, we are telling one another you're wrong, and that your way of life is not going to help us. And I think that it's more important to try to think in some other terms. First of all, an offspring of parents has the chance to form and live their life in such a fashion that their parents will come around to agreement in time and be proud of the fact and pleased of the fact that they've raised a daughter or a son who's carried life forward. They won't be pleased at this end of it, but very often they will be pleased at what they see happening to their offspring, and when they see the character and well-being. I know that to be the case. That's one of the reasons I committed myself to being a pastor, even while engaged in struggle on the outside in jails and the rest of it. So that's one possibility. The other idea is that when we do face-to-face with each other, it's important for us to not do it one time only, but as you are doing it, to do it steadily on a regular basis with every opportunity. And in nonviolent tactics, I call that the face-to-face encounter, or the face-to-face tactic. And it's an essential tactic for organizing any kind of a organization or group, congregation, union. I've taught it to union people. One of the fastest growing unions in the United States is in Los Angeles, where I spent a whole session with them on workshops on face-to-face encounter, where people are so damaged by their workaday situation, this is what we met, that they cannot talk about it. So I encourage people to go into not try to talk to them in the shop or in the workspace or outside the workplace. I urged organizers to, and then prepared them to go out into the community and find this person in the community and do face-to-face. First of all, get them to talk about their own situation, their own fears, how important that job is for their well-being, all the rest of it. And out of that process of face-to-face, we have seen, in fact, a labor movement grow in Los Angeles that's now second only to New York in terms of density of labor members since about the 1980s. So face-to-face encounters that put all the accent upon the people, on the person who you want to see move from where they are to where you think they can be, and to never say that. In fact, as a pastor and working with unions, I did something that I hadn't heard anyone else do, and that is this. I said to the union, as I'd said to myself in my church, to visit people and never to ask them to join my church. But let the face-to-face encounter over a period of weeks or months or longer help the person make their own decisions of faith. Help the worker to begin to be willing to acknowledge where he was and the dirty lack of safety in the space, the bad wages and the animosity of the bosses. And then begin to talk about it to family and others. And that, one of my greatest joys now is being engaged with some of those people from the 80s who are magnificent species of life. Hispanic and black and Asian in some of the unions where I worked for 10, 15, 20 years. 30 years in work. So stick with it. Don't give it up. Find the ways to be open, generous, loving, and to help the other to open up their lives with you. They will make better connections with you as a consequence, and that's one of the first consequences of face-to-face. They'll make connections with you as human beings that they've never made before. So that in itself is a great experience, great miracle of life.
We have another question. Here's one.
So first of all, I need to apologize for the legacy that I bequeathed to this country by my own country. The second point that I'd like to make is that I know that your address has been principally directed to those who are of a slightly younger generation than yours and mine, but everything you said greatly resonated with me. I would just like to ask you how this country of the United States can deal with the issue of violence as exhibited by the power of the NRA to perpetrate an amazing situation whereby the Second Amendment, which was passed at a time when the population of this country was 1% of what it is today, still is in force. And secondly, one statistic which is quite frightening is that in March 2015, there were more killings by police in the United States than there had been in the UK since 1900. Now, of course, there's a population
That's right.
difference, but even if you address that difference, you have a situation where there were more killings in 1 month, March 2015, than there had been in the UK since in the last 40 years. How is this country going to address this violence issue?
Well, that's a huge, huge, huge question, isn't it? Because the issue of the gun is an issue of some 400 or 500 years of the mythology of violence that we have made a part of our inner beings in the United States. And how that's going to be reversed, who really knows how that can be reversed? I suspect, however, that it has to be probably to build the national campaign, going to require many local campaigns and many campaigns at the state level to ultimately do it. The issue, in my judgment, is not the Second Amendment and is not the gun. The Second Amendment, of course, is a part of what racist violence has been about, because it was adopted as a compromise to allow the plantation owner to create a posse to go out and capture escaping slaves. That was in that debate in the Constitutional Conventions in 1788, 79, 89 rather. So the NRA has reversed the meaning of that amendment. The issue is the violence itself. How does our nation become again a more violent, a more non-violent nation? I grew up, even in the midst of World War II, in junior high and high school in World War II, I grew up in a local community with many other similar communities around the country where there were no guns and there were no killings, and where one was not afraid of walking in the street or playing at midnight in the streets. So how do we return to that for every community when the priority of our nation's life, of our national life, has been and is war and war making in the name of the mythology of violence? How do we deal with this violence in our own country when our biggest corporation in the world is our Pentagon, and where so many industries are making great profits by exporting weapons? We remain the #1 exporter of weapons in the world. We have been that way since prior to World War II. So how do you deal with this question in just a simple fashion? And I maintain that a part of the beginning place is with each of us in our own localities where we live and work, but I also maintain that there is where we have to do the business. And when sufficient numbers of us do that business at the local level, I think then we'll see the explosion of a campaign that will override the NRA, and probably not override it until that local the local campaigns take place. One place where I disagree with Black Lives Matters is this. notice that even when a 12-year-old boy, black boy, is shot and killed by a police officer, ostensibly because he had a toy gun in his hand outside in the front of his home. This is Cleveland, Ohio, 2 years ago. Tamar Rice. Why, besides the President of the United States, haven't we had many local voices expressing shame and disgust that such an act can go on in our country anywhere? Why has not the Chamber of Commerce expressed dismay over the killing of a 16-year-old boy? Or in the case of Los Angeles, 5 years ago, a 19-month baby girl in the arms of her very drunk father, killed by a police assault attack. Now, I'm saying to you that part of the beginning place is to begin to abolish the mythology of the value of violence in our local places. The other thing I'm going to say about that is that the violence in the last 100 years have reached a proportion that we cannot even measure and we do not even know. But a part of the reason for that violence is the agreement of the plantation owner in the 1880s, the 70s and 80s, with white working people, sometimes craft unions, that black people had to be forced back into another form of slavery after Reconstruction. This was done by the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, that was actually a semi-religious as well as a semi-racist, semi-political group. They announced in 1866, they announced their theology as that the God who created white people did not create people of color, or what they called mud people, and that people of color were created by a satanic force or a demagogue or a false god. The emergence of the KKK in small towns and large towns across the central section of our country, as well as in the Deep South, is what, therefore, started the path of no jobs for black people, except menial jobs. So a specific illustration of this is that professional baseball had already begun in the 19th century. But with that merger between business and working people, white working people, the black ball players in baseball were all terminated. And professional baseball became a segregated sport, and not until 1947 was it eventually challenged. I don't know if people realize that that's a part of what happened. A black man who came off a plantation who was an electrician was told in Pulaski, Tennessee, the code between the business community of Pulaski, Tennessee, where the KKK was founded, with white workers was that black man off the plantation who was an electrician will never have work in Pulaski, Tennessee. The same thing happened with South Bend, Indiana, Cincinnati, Ohio, with Peoria, Illinois. That contract between the plantation owner and craft unions is what created the higher levels of unemployment in the black community all through the 20th century into the 21st century. So the point I guess I'm making is that that has to be cracked. It's one of the structures that's unknown.
One more question someone would...
There's a hand behind the pillar, and there's another hand near that pillar.
Ah, there's one.
Okay.
Okay. Hi.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. It's been wonderful.
Okay, there you are.
As our country becomes, it feels more and more partisan, I'm having a really difficult time remaining optimistic about future change. And so I was wondering how you feel about the relationship between optimism and social change and political action in your own work.
Well, I don't know if I'm an optimist at all. I just happen to think that I've seen all kinds of changes. We can make all kinds of changes. Present political scene is not politics. It's more connected to racism and sexism than it is political. There's another kind of politics. There's the politics of the preamble of the Constitution and the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, in which case the founding fathers, who were following the will of thousands, wrote preambles that suggest here's some of the big language that we have to keep debating. I marvel at the fact that they wrote such big language in a time when oppression was far more the form of governance than what they were saying. So I think we need to let our elected officials and let donors and advertisers know that what the Tea Party represents is pea-brain, pea-soul politics. It's not the politics of our Constitution. It's not the politics. And if, as a pastor, I know it's not the politics of the Scriptures. The Scriptures suggest both Moses and Jesus, the two towering figures of the Hebrew and Christian Bibles, the two towering figures, 3,300 years before the present moment, before us, insisted that the way of God, or the way of the universe, is a way for politics. And that's the politics of seeing to it that the stranger, the alien, are not really strangers, are treated like you treat yourself, that the widow is not devastated by her new condition in life, that the hungry are fed, that where injustice is present, you break the yoke of that injustice. And Moses and Jesus both thought that each one of us can do that as we walk through life in our own way. So that's another form of politics that's available. The politics of the Cold War, the politics of the power brokers of our society, is a politics that is not politics and is doomed for failure. That's I think, the perspective of history. And so I know that they cannot win. We knew in the Southern movement, Martin King and others of us, that segregation was wrong, ineffective, was a shameful experience for the nation to continue to tolerate, and that it had to change, that the segregationist perspective had to fail. Well, it hasn't failed yet completely, because we still have too much segregation, too much racism, and too many structures of these. But at least it began the movement to make the change. And so what I'm saying to you is, I guess, that I'm not optimistic as such. I think the times are very crude, but I am convinced that the crudity of our times is a waste of energy and time and cannot ultimately win. The more of us who insist upon our own lifestyle and well-being in opposition to it, the more will break out the movements that will change it emphatically. this is a time of slow social change because the enemies of our society have more money. Violence is better organized than it has ever been, especially with the Pentagon. And so the NRA has more big money supporting its view across the nation. So it's because of that. But if more of us would not see elections as the major way in which we are engaged, but as our engagement on a daily basis where we live, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, I think we can see that change more rapidly than what one expects. When I moved south in 1958, I shook Dr. Martin King's hand for the first time on February 6, 1957. And Martin pushed me very concretely and to come south, go south as fast as I could, which I did. Most folk in the black community thought I was pretty crazy. And when I organized struggles for social change, and a lot of people within the SCLC circles at that time, which was brand new, thought that we couldn't do what we did. But we were right. You know? Most people in this room don't remember the 40s or the 50s or the 60s into the 70s. But this crowd in this room at New York University could not have met at New York University in 1950 or 1960. Would not have met. This diverse group of people could not have been here, would not have been here in 1960. You would not have seen women faculty people or people of color in administration and faculty. You would not have even seen a person of color as a policeman in the city of New York at that time. I mean, across the board. And there were people who acted as though this was immutable and would be forever. But there were also some of us growing up at that time who said it has to change and we can change it. And then put our lives into the hopper to make it happen. And it did change. It's not yet changed enough. You know, the present moment is a moment where we see how much has yet to be done. But it can be changed. The Tea Party will either lead us down the road to an apocalyptic society or it will fail. And it will not fail as long as ordinary people do not rise up on behalf of truth and beauty and justice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I know I speak for everyone to say that was a deeply inspiring and profoundly moving presentation.
And in the NYU bookstore, you can pick up Nonviolence and Social Movements, the teachings of Reverend James Lawson. So I want to do that plug. Thank you.